The year is 1636, and a group of Puritan settlers are gathered together in the town of Cambridge, which at this point in history was little more than a clearing in the woods inhabited by a handful of families. Their settlement, which would eventually become known as New England, had been founded just a few years earlier with the arrival of John Winthrop's company of Puritan refugees seeking religious freedom from the Church of England. But now, amidst the struggles of a fledgling colony, they find themselves at a crossroads. On one hand, there is the pressing need to build homes, plant crops, and defend against the ever-present threat of attack from the native population or rival European powers. But on the other, these men, many of whom were ministers, merchants, or artisans, knew that the long-term survival of their colony depended upon something else, the creation of a learned and educated ministry capable of guiding the spiritual and civil affairs of a burgeoning state. In short, they needed schools and a college. But how could they even consider such luxuries when the colony had yet to turn a profit? How could they prioritize education over the very survival of their settlement? Well, first off, let me clarify that although the Puritan settlers did not arrive in North America with any silver spoons in their mouths, they certainly weren't destitute either. In fact, given the fact that they all voluntarily left England, sold their property, and pooled their resources to finance the voyage across the Atlantic, we can safely say that these people were well off by 17th century standards. What they lacked, however, was economic opportunity. And so far, life in New England hadn't exactly been a financial boon for them. Food was scarce, housing was rudimentary, and death rates were high. On top of all that, they had recently fought a brutal war with the natives, who still viewed the settlers as unwelcome guests on their land. But despite all of this, the Puritans persevered. They saw their hardships as but a momentary inconvenience compared to the eternal rewards that awaited them in the afterlife, if they remained steadfast in their devotion to God and His plan for their settlement. And as evidence of divine favor, they pointed to the remarkable success of their first harvest, which suggested that they may have finally found the economic stability they so desperately desired. Now, it was at this critical juncture that the Massachusetts General Court decided to invest in education. You see, the Puritans believed that each individual had a calling in life, a divine mission that they were duty-bound to fulfill. This calling might be to till the soil, raise cattle, craft tools, or preach the word of God. But whatever it was essential that each person follow it faithfully. Unfortunately, most of the ministers who accompanied the settlers to New England were neither trained nor particularly gifted in the role. And so the ministers who served as regents to the General Court, realizing that the future of their colony depended on creating a pool of educated clergy, petitioned the court to establish a college. And so in 1636, the Massachusetts Bay Company, which was essentially the governing body of the colony at this time, granted the request and established the new college at Cambridge. For their part, the ministers were ecstatic. In a letter to the Reverend John Cotton in England, the minister, John Eliot, wrote, "We cannot but look upon it as the greatest mercy of God to us in this country, that He hath raised up amongst us so many godly and learned ministers. For what would become of us without the ministry of the word, we do not desire to think." Now, while the timing of this endeavor was certainly ambitious, if not foolhardy, the Puritans' vision for their new institution was actually quite modest. Despite the grandiose name, the new college at Cambridge started out as nothing more than a meeting house made from unhewn timber and a schoolhouse constructed from planks. And given the lack of funds, students were expected to provide their own housing, meaning that the only residents of Cambridge were the handful of families living in the village and those attending the college. At least for now, that was the plan. But before classes could even begin, the Puritans had to address a major problem. They didn't have anyone to teach. And so they turned once again to England, this time sending a delegation of ministers to recruit teachers. When the delegation failed to return with any candidates, however, the Puritans were forced to get creative. And so it was that the college opened its doors in 1638 with a single student and no teachers. Can you believe it? A college with 0 professors. Nonetheless, classes began with 2 local ministers serving as tutors until such time as a proper faculty could be hired. And to that end, the Puritans used the meager funds available to offer the tutors salaries of £60 per year, plus free housing and board, which I guess wasn't all that meager actually, considering that the average laborer earned about £10 per year. As time went on, however, the Puritans came to realize that the realities of colonial life were far different from the ideal they had envisioned. And nowhere was this more evident than at their cherished college. See, unlike their counterparts back in England, the Puritan settlers of New England were mostly not landowners. In fact, aside from a few merchants, most of the settlers were small farmers, artisans, and laborers. And as such, they couldn't afford to send their children to a college, especially when the curriculum was entirely focused on theology and classical languages, which offered little practical value in a growing agricultural community. By 1642, then only 3 students were enrolled at the college, which forced the tutors to supplement their income by taking on private students. This arrangement worked well enough until the tutors were able to secure funding from the government to pay for their salaries, meaning that the college operated for nearly 6 years without charging tuition. By 1643, the Puritans had resolved to change this by instituting a system of fees based on a student's ability to pay. While this helped to generate revenue for the school, it also led to a decline in enrollment, especially after the American Revolutionary War broke out in 1775. C. The Puritans had always prided themselves on their commitment to education, believing that it was the key to unlocking God's plan for their colony. However, as the war dragged on and the cost of maintaining a college became too great, they were forced to make a difficult decision. Should they continue to fund the school at the expense of their dwindling economy? Or should they focus on winning the war and securing their independence from Britain? In the end, the Puritans opted to do both. After much debate, they agreed to scale back the college's operations and move it from Cambridge to the more central location of Concord. There, in a series of simple wooden buildings, the school continued to educate the next generation of New Englanders, albeit with fewer students and a more practical curriculum. It was during this time that the school began to incorporate courses on subjects like agriculture, carpentry, and surveying, which were much more relevant to the needs of their growing community. This shift in focus marked a significant departure from the original vision of the college, which had been designed to train ministers and scholars. But as the Puritan settlers adapted to the challenges of colonial life, so too did their institutions of higher learning. Now, despite these setbacks, the college endured, laying the foundation for the future State University of New England. In fact, it was during this time that some of the most important early American texts were written, including Increase Mather's Wonders of the Invisible World, which chronicled the Salem witch trials, and Cotton Mather's Magnalia Christi Americana, which provided the first comprehensive history of Christianity in North America. Both of these books were written in the college's library, which doubled as the home of the first publicly funded public school in the American colonies. Now, imagine, if you will, that you are a young Puritan boy named Samuel, making your way to school through the dense New England forest. Your schoolmaster is a stern but fair man named Thomas, who believes that education is the key to unlocking God's plan for each individual. The lessons you learn in his one-room schoolhouse are simple, focusing on reading, writing, arithmetic, and basic religious instruction. But they are no less important for that. Each day begins with a prayer and ends with a psalm, reminding you that God is the source of all knowledge and the guide of all righteous men. As you grow older, you attend the newly established college in Concord, where you are taught by some of the most learned men in the colonies. The curriculum is rigorous, emphasizing theology, classics, and philosophy. But you are also exposed to practical subjects like agriculture and carpentry. Life as a student is not easy, but you work hard, knowing that your success is not for your own sake, but for the sake of your family and your community. As you walk the campus, you pass by the humble wooden buildings, each one bearing silent witness to the dreams of a fledgling colony. In the evenings, you gather with your fellow students in the flickering lamplight, poring over ancient texts and debating the latest theological controversies. Outside, the wind whispers through the trees, carrying with it the sounds of the frontier, the buzz of insects, the hoot of an owl, the distant cry of a whippoorwill. These are the sounds of your world, a world on the edge of civilization, where the wilderness stretches as far as the eye can see, and the only law is the law of God and the law of the land. You know that your task as a Puritan is to tame this wilderness, to bring it under the yoke of civilization, and to Christianize its inhabitants. You also know, however, that this task will not be easy. The forests are ancient and vast, the animals are wild and dangerous, and the Native Americans are fierce and proud. But you are not afraid, for you have God on your side and you have the education and skills to succeed. You are a product of the Puritan vision, a man of God and a master of the frontier. Your story, like that of your colony, has just begun. Hey everyone, thanks for watching Chapter 2 of our series, Puritan, Visionaries, and Colonial America. Don't forget to check back for new episodes every week. And if you want to support our work, you can join our membership program today. And as always, thanks for watching.